Fighting for His glory. What an interesting title. The more I thought about this, the less I thought about fighting as a whole and more about understanding the fight. Fighting, as I understand it, is to defend or protect values or to defend or protect the innocent. You only win a fight when your opponent cannot or will not carry on. And you only lose a fight when you choose to not carry on or you reach a place where you can't carry on. When I was a kid, I watched Saturday Night Wrestling with my dad. And all the professional stars had a finishing move. It was their signature move they used to finish an opponent. It was what they did to finish a match. We saw everything from the Las Vegas leg lock of Ric Flair, woo, all the way down to Mr. Wrestling No. 2's devastating knee lift. In mixed martial arts, you finish a fight now either by a technical knockout or a knockout or by some kind of submission hold or a blood choke or something like that. What happens when you finish your opponent by using one of those techniques, you win the fight. And if you get finished, you lose the fight. There's a big difference when Elijah wanders out into the wilderness and says, "It is enough," and when Jesus says, "It is finished." Paul says, "I have fought a good fight. I have finished my course. I have kept the faith." So I want to talk to you about the difference in being finished and finishing. One instance is that you've crossed the line and said, "I'm done," and I quit, and you lose. The other instance is when you decide to carry something all the way through and you reach a place where you've decided that you've done all that you can do. In my mind, it's simply about understanding surrender. You must give up in order to quit and lose. And you must give up surrender in order to let God have the power in your life so that you can win. There's no modern war college. There's no tactical school, Annapolis, West Point, Tactical Explosive Entry School in Orlando, Thunder Ranch, and Memphis. None of those schools teach Old Testament warfare tactics. The reason they don't teach Old Testament warfare tactics is Old Testament warfare tactics don't work. When somebody is held hostage in a building, the SWAT team doesn't gather around the building and march in a circle and then yell, "Hostages, come out," and the buildings fall down. SWAT teams don't triangulate a position and keep their flashlights under a jar and break the jar, and when all the lights come out, they blow trumpets. See, those tactics weren't about the tactics. Those tactics were about the power of God. And so when we talk about fighting, it's about understanding that this fight is not about our power, but this fight is about God's power. In 2 Corinthians 4:7, it says that we have been given a treasure, something very valuable, and that treasure is contained in a clay jar, something very vulnerable. And the reason God put something so valuable into something so vulnerable was to demonstrate that the excellency of the power is not about us, but the excellence of the power actually comes from God. You read 2 Corinthians, and it talks about that these dirt jars are forsaken and perplexed and hard-pressed on every side, but in the end, they're not crushed or abandoned or destroyed. Why? Because it's not about the jar, it's about God. And when you're not crushed and you're not in despair and you're not abandoned and you're not destroyed, that means the power of God is working in you. And by the way, that's surviving a fight. That's finishing a fight. So what do you do to understand how God's power works in our lives in our fight? So how does God's power work in our lives in our fight? Romans 8:28 says all things work together for the good of those who love Him. The idiocy of thinking that God is some cruel chess master who places pawns on the board to get wiped out just so he can teach some kind of an object lesson is at best bad theology and at worst just ignorance of God. God doesn't kill teenagers in car wrecks. God doesn't fly airplanes into buildings. God doesn't give people cancer or have mothers abandon babies just to teach a lesson or make a point. What Romans 8:28 teaches is when those things happen, when things happen because of our own rebellion or because of our own stubbornness or because of our own sin, or when sin or evil crosses our path, or just because we're non-permanent residents in a non-permanent plane of existence, when those things run together, it doesn't say that God causes them, but that God uses His providence to cause good things to happen from that. See, it's not that God makes those things happen just so He can set up some magical lesson. It's God watches our lives, and when those kinds of things happen, either because of our own rebellion or our own stupidity or our own immaturity, or because we become victims of evil, or simply because we're citizens of a planet that's controlled by physics, when those things happen, God can take any of those circumstances and make something good happen from it. Interestingly enough, I had my epiphany in Romans chapter 8 from a silly cartooning game I play with kids. I used to visit the middle schools and the grammar schools and teach cartooning lessons. And you get in trouble when you're in a classroom full of kids and you say, okay, now that we've had a cartooning lesson, would you like me to draw something on the board? Every time some little 5th grade boy will say, draw the pink Power Ranger. Well, it's inappropriate to draw the pink Power Ranger for the 5th graders. And you say, well, I don't want to draw the pink Power Ranger. He says, well, you can't. I can. You can't. Yes, I can. No, you can't. You're mom. And then it just degrades really, really bad. So instead of trying to take requests, we started playing the scribble game. A kid comes up to the board, makes a scribble. And then you see if you can take that scribble and turn it into something that makes sense. I played it with my daughter for years. One night we were all at a restaurant in Nashville, the restaurant where they let you draw on the tablecloths. Several of us were scribbling on the tablecloth, and in fact we scribbled so much that we had to get a new tablecloth. We had friends there with us, Randy and Lisa Corder, Shauna Brown, and we ate and had a good time. Months later, we're at the Corder's home. They just bought a new house, and we'd eaten steak, watching a football game. Lisa came in and said, hey, Jones, I want to show you Joshua's new room. So I got up and walked into the back of the house where their brand new bedroom was for their son Joshua. She said, a couple of nights ago, our neighbor had an emergency, and they took their oldest child to the hospital, and we kept their youngest child, and she slept in Joshua's room. And while she was in there by herself, she got a red magic marker and walked all over this room, and as high as she could reach, all 4 years old of her, scribbled all over this wall. Brand new house. She said, we can paint this room, or we can turn you loose in here with some markers, and we'll have some original Lonnie Jones artwork. I said, you're asking me to draw on your walls with permanent markers? And she said, yeah. And so I did. I started exploring the room, and there was an S curve that made a beautiful brachiosaurus grazing on some tropical plants in front of a volcano. There was an almost perfect vertical line that became the blade of a lightsaber, and a Star Wars character standing on a giant mushroom. There were some Dr. Seuss characters already placed on the wall. And while I was drawing, and my wife says she's not sure if it was the Holy Spirit or the marker fumes, I had an epiphany of Romans 8:28. See, sometimes I take my marker, and because I'm rebellious or sinful, I mark on that wall. Sometimes evil comes in and takes my marker and marks on my wall. Sometimes my wall just gets marks on it because things are careless and things happen in a world controlled by physics. And I'm standing here looking at this mess. And God says, let me have your marker. And if I give my marker to God, God's not a cartoonist. God's a world painter. God makes rainbows and sunsets. God makes seascapes and snowscapes. And God, the ultimate artist of the universe, takes that mess that either I made or that evil made, and God makes it make sense. That's what Romans 8:28 teaches. And that's why the fight is not about us. It's about us giving control of our weapons or our marker to God and letting God make sense when the world doesn't. And that's what I believe it means to fight for His glory, to understand that the fight is not about us or our power, but about giving our power to God so that He can control our marker and make sense in a senseless world sometimes.